They liked telling people I had no direction. Said it casually like a diagnosis they'd already agreed on. I never corrected them. I let the story harden around me, because there's a strange kind of power in being underestimated. Some exits don't need announcements. They just need patience, timing, and the discipline to stay quiet until silence becomes leverage. For a long time, I occupied a convenient role in other people's lives. The one who hadn't figured it out yet. The one with potential that was apparently going to waste. They spoke about my future as if it were a public project, something open for commentary, comparison, and judgment. It wasn't always cruel on the surface. Sometimes it was wrapped in concern, sometimes in jokes, sometimes in that polite disappointment people use when they want to feel superior without sounding harsh. I learned early that ambition is often measured loudly. People trust motion more than intention. If you aren't visibly chasing something, they assume you're standing still. And if you're standing still, they feel entitled to narrate why. So they did. They built a version of me that suited them. Unmotivated, comfortable, dependent, safe to overlook. I didn't argue. Not because they were right, but because arguing would have meant explaining myself to people who were never listening. I understood something they didn't. Every label they placed on me lowered expectations. And lowered expectations create space. Space to think. Space to observe. Space to prepare without interference. While they debated my lack of ambition, I was learning what it meant to leave without asking for permission. It started subtly. Comments made when I wasn't fully part of the conversation. A laugh that lingered a second too long. Advice I hadn't asked for, delivered with the confidence of someone who believed they were above me. They compared timelines. They compared salaries. They compared milestones, and somehow I always came out behind. What made it worse wasn't the words themselves, but how comfortable they were saying them. As if my life had already been decided. As if I had agreed to the role. They spoke freely because they assumed I had nowhere else to go. That assumption became the foundation of everything that followed. I watched how power moved in rooms. Who interrupted whom? Who waited to be acknowledged? Who was spoken about instead of spoken to? I noticed how often ambition was confused with performance. Loud plans. Public hustles. Visible exhaustion worn like a badge. And I noticed how those same people panicked the moment something went quiet. Silence unsettled them. So I stayed quiet. They mistook my restraint for confusion. My listening for passivity. My lack of defense for agreement. Each misinterpretation made my position safer. When people think they understand you, they stop watching closely. They stop asking questions that matter. Behind that misunderstanding, I started making changes that didn't show up in conversation. I simplified my life. Reduced dependencies. Learned skills that didn't earn applause. I saved more than I spent. I stopped sharing ideas before they were ready. I stopped explaining decisions that weren't final. Meanwhile, the jokes continued. Someone once said I'd probably be doing the same thing in 5 years. Everyone laughed. I smiled, because correcting them would have required revealing a map they didn't deserve to see. The pressure wasn't just external. There were moments alone when their voices echoed louder than I wanted to admit. When I wondered if staying silent made me complicit in my own erasure. But every time that doubt surfaced, I remembered how quickly people try to control what they can label. If I defended myself too early, they would adjust. They would interfere. They would offer help that came with strings or criticism disguised as guidance. So I let the narrative stand. I let it grow. They invited me into conversations about my own limitations. Asked what was holding me back. Suggested safer options. Smaller goals. Backup plans. They believed they were mentoring me downward. What they didn't realize was that every suggestion told me exactly how they saw me. And knowing that made my eventual departure cleaner. I began to detach emotionally long before I left physically. That's the part no one notices. When you stop needing validation from a group, their influence weakens. Their opinions become background noise instead of instruction. I stopped reacting. I stopped correcting. I stopped hoping they'd see me differently. That's when the balance shifted. They still thought they had leverage. Still believed their approval mattered. still assumed proximity equaled control. They didn't see the quiet preparation as movement because it didn't look like theirs. The day I decided to leave wasn't dramatic.
No argument. No final insult.
Just a moment of clarity where I realized staying longer would only require me to keep playing a role I'd already outgrown. Leaving didn't feel like rebellion. It felt like alignment. I didn't announce anything. I didn't hint. I didn't test reactions. I just continued behaving exactly as they expected, right up until the moment I wasn't there anymore. Absence is disorienting when people assume permanence. They don't notice the last normal day. They only notice the silence afterward. Messages unanswered. Invitations declined without explanation. A presence removed without ceremony. At first, they joked about it. Said I was probably trying something temporary. A phase. Then the joke stopped. Confusion replaced certainty. The narrative they'd built required my participation, and without me, it started collapsing. They reached out. Asked where I'd gone. What I was doing. The same people who never asked before suddenly wanted updates. I kept my responses brief. Polite. Non-specific. Silence had trained them to underestimate me. Now distance trained them to rethink. What unsettled them most wasn't my success or failure. It was the lack of access. They no longer had a front-row seat to my life. No benchmarks to compare. No way to position themselves above or below me. The hierarchy they relied on needed visibility, and I had removed myself from the frame. I heard later that they speculated. Some assumed I'd failed quietly. Others suspected I'd planned more than they thought. That uncertainty bothered them. People prefer a clear story, even if it's unflattering. Ambiguity threatens status. I never corrected the record, because the truth was never meant for them. The exit was. At first, they joked about it. Said I was probably trying something temporary. A phase. Then the joke stopped. Confusion replaced certainty. The narrative they'd built required my participation, and without me, it started collapsing. They reached out. Asked where I'd gone. What I was doing. The same people who never asked before suddenly wanted updates. I kept my responses brief.
Polite.
Non-specific. Silence had trained them to underestimate me. Now distance trained them to rethink. What unsettled them most wasn't my success or failure. It was the lack of access. They no longer had a front-row seat to my life. No benchmarks to compare. No way to position themselves above or below me. The hierarchy they relied on needed visibility, and I had removed myself from the frame. I heard later that they speculated. Some assumed I'd failed quietly. Others suspected I'd planned more than they thought. That uncertainty bothered them. People prefer a clear story, even if it's unflattering. Ambiguity threatens status. I never corrected the record, because the truth was never meant for them. The exit was. Distance has a way of revealing what proximity hides. Away from their commentary, I saw how much energy I'd spent managing perceptions instead of possibilities. How often I'd shrunk myself to avoid conflict. How silence, once protective, had become preparatory. I realized that ambition doesn't always announce itself because not all goals require witnesses. Some plans fail if exposed too early. Some transformations need privacy to survive their early stages. Their misjudgment had given me cover. By believing I lacked direction, they stopped trying to redirect me. By assuming I was stuck, they stopped monitoring my movement. What they called apathy was actually focus without noise. I also saw something less flattering. How easily people confuse familiarity with entitlement. They thought they deserved explanations because they'd invested opinions. They believed access was permanent because it had always been available. My leaving challenged that belief. Power, I learned, isn't always about confrontation. Sometimes it's about choosing where you no longer participate. About removing yourself from systems that only function if you accept a diminished role. The absence became the message. Not dramatic enough to provoke open conflict, but strong enough to disrupt their certainty. I didn't need to prove them wrong publicly. I just needed to stop proving them right by staying. What stayed with me wasn't satisfaction or revenge. It was clarity. The understanding that self-respect doesn't always look like standing your ground. Sometimes it looks like walking away before you're asked to defend why you're standing there at all. They still don't know the full story, and they never will. That was never the point. Leaving without explanation wasn't cruelty. It was closure. A decision to stop negotiating my worth with people who'd already decided it for me. So, I'll leave you with this. When someone underestimates you, do you rush to correct them, or do you quietly change the environment until their opinion no longer matters? And when you finally leave, will you need to explain why, or will your absence say enough?